Before we begin this video, I need to make a very important announcement. A close friend of mine, Abu Bakr Rafiq, is currently on the Sumud Flotilla, which is about to reach Gaza as we speak. Their goal is to break the Zionist siege of Gaza and distribute aid to our brothers and sisters, and Israel is doing everything they can to stop them. Abu Bakr's ship has already been attacked by drones multiple times, and it is very likely that Israel will escalate its violence to stop the flotilla. They have butchered aid workers in the past before, so this is a life or death situation. Abu Bakr is one of the most sincere brothers I have ever met in my life. He was at the forefront of the Palestine encampment at City University, and now he's putting his life on the line to give our brothers and sisters the aid they desperately need. I urge every single one of you watching, please follow Sumud Flotilla and Abu Bakr's social media accounts. You'll be updated on the flotilla and if Israel does anything to them. And also, if you are an Australian citizen, please contact Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong via email. Let them know that the lives of the Australians on board the flotilla, including Abu Bakr, are on the line. There's a draft email you can send to them, which I have included in the description below. Pause this video, please pause it and come back once you have done all these steps on screen. And last thing, I have partnered up with Human Appeal Australia to raise donations for our brothers and sisters in Gaza. They currently have teams on the ground giving food and aid as we speak. So if you would like to support this initiative in any capacity, you can find more details in the description below. Thank you.
This is Unpacked. On the surface, this YouTube channel of over 400,000 subscribers might seem normal. After all they do is post videos about Jewish life, history and culture. Surely their content is harmless, right? But what if I told you that Unpacked is not just some humble YouTube channel, it's part of a much larger machine, a propaganda machine with ties to powerful Zionist groups, the Israeli terrorist state itself, and a very specific goal: to whitewash Zionism and salvage its dying reputation. You see, Unpacked is part of Open Door Media, an Israeli media company that doesn't just make YouTube videos, they do a lot more than that. They create curriculums for schools, educational resources, podcasts, and even producing their own films. Many of them serve as propaganda for the so-called State of Israel. But here's where it gets really interesting. Open Door Media is partnered with dozens of powerful Zionist groups, including the Canadian branch of the Jewish National Fund. The JNF has a long record of purchasing Palestinian land for Zionist settlement, planting forests on the ruins of destroyed Palestinian villages, and they have even used millions of Canadian tax dollars to fund projects in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Open Door Media has also partnered with the Jewish Federations of North America, who, according to reports, has raised almost a whopping $1 billion for Israel. And most concerning of all, one of Open Door Media's proud partners is Israel itself, specifically the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs and Combating Anti-Semitism. So this all raises a very important question. Why does a media company that makes educational videos on YouTube get endorsed by powerful Zionist organizations and Israel, the terrorist state that is currently committing one of the worst genocides in living memory? Well, I believe it's because Israel is facing a crisis unlike no other. Ever since October 7, global support for Israel has plummeted by the day. People from all across the world, people who didn't even know anything about the plight of the Palestinian people, have woken up to Israel's lies. Sure, your hardline Zionists are always going to exist, your Ben Shapiro's, your Charlie Kirk's, your Jordan Petersons of the world, but they've too become laughing stocks across the political spectrum, even by their own supporters. That is why I believe that Zionists online have decided to course correct. They know that anyone who cartoonishly supports Israel are not going to be accepted by the general public.
The propaganda? Well, look, no, I think that we've not been winning it, to put it mildly. I think there are vast forces that are arrayed against us. That's a big issue. We have to contend with it. And we also have to stand up and tell the truth, probably at greater frequency than we're doing now. That's exactly what I'm trying to do now. But again, if you want to win this war, end it speedily. Expose the lies as much as you can. End it speedily, and that's how you win the war. You win the war, the propaganda war, by winning the war and winning the peace.
This is where Unpacked comes to play. They produce their videos connecting Jewish history, culture, and identity to the state of Israel itself. They do this because, like every other country, Israel needs a story, a founding myth to justify its existence on the world stage. If these stories fall apart, so do people's allegiance and loyalty to their own country. Open Door Media even acknowledge themselves that support for Israel among the Jewish youth is declining worldwide, and without that loyalty, Zionism, the very ideology that drives Israel's existence today, comes to question. Zionists can easily tolerate criticism of Netanyahu or the far-right government or the extreme settlers. It is very easy to do that. Even the Israeli people themselves are starting to turn against Netanyahu, but it is another thing itself to turn your criticism towards Zionism. That's something that the Zionists do not want whatsoever, because by challenging Zionism, you are challenging Israel's very right to exist. And this is really why I believe Unpacked is important for two reasons. Firstly, they legitimize Israel by linking the modern state itself to centuries of persecution faced by the Jewish people. What this does is that it suggests that Jewish people have never been truly accepted anywhere in the world, and that the only way to end their suffering, to end their persecution, is to return to their so-called ancestral homeland and forge their own nation. This is the building block of Israel's national story, the very narrative they cling onto to survive, which is exactly why I believe that Zionist groups proudly endorse Unpacked's content. And second of all, Unpacked presents itself as a supposedly moderating voice when covering Palestine. Again, openly being a hardcore Zionist in today's society turns people away. So what Unpacked does instead is that in many of their videos, they shift the focus away from what Zionism has done to the Palestinians and instead frame the occupation as a complicated conflict between two equal sides. So basically the whole two-state solution thing. To give an example which I believe does this, back in 2019, Unpacked made a video about the Dead Yassin massacre. And if you don't know what the Dead Yassin massacre was, it was one of the worst atrocities during the Nakba. It is one of the events that people associate with the ongoing occupation of the Palestinian people. So instead of denying the massacre or saying that it didn't happen, what Unpacked does instead is that they frame it as like a complicated, there's two sides of the story situation. And then on top of that, they end their video by saying that it's been taken advantage of by these anti-Zionist activists who hate Israel and want to put them down.
The hyperbole surrounding the events of that day, in which the Arabs wanted to demonize the Jewish enemy to rile up local Arabs and inflame the entire Arab world, was so effective that it did just that. It terrified the Arabs to the point that many fled, ultimately becoming refugees of the war. At various points, it has been weaponized, exaggerated, or mythologized to make the Jewish armies look like demons, and the Jewish state to be born in sin. In the end, the capture of Deir Yassin in April 1948 was a strategic victory for the Jews trying to break the Arab siege on Jerusalem. But the killing of civilians, even if some were armed, makes it an undeniable tragedy.
That's just one example of how Unpacked reframes the ongoing occupation of the Palestinian people. And another way they do it, in one of the recent videos about a West Bank settlement, instead of saying that Israel should own all the land and that the Palestinians don't belong there, what they do instead is that they distort history of this particular settlement they talk about and say that because the land was bought 100 years ago, then therefore it is legal and it's valid, and that the people there just want to live their lives. They want to find a place where they can just be. The whole point is that, again, they don't resort to demonizing the Palestinians. They don't resort to glorifying Israel. But what they do is that they add these little asterisks. They use history to justify their narrative by saying that because this land was bought 100 years ago, then this settlement is valid. It is legal. Even though, according to the United Nations themselves, not just that settlement, but any settlement in the West Bank is illegal under international law. I could spend a lot more time talking about these videos, but I want to focus on one in particular. One video which I think doesn't get enough attention by the public: the rise and fall of Jews in the Ottoman Empire. You might be confused on why, out of all the videos Unpacked has made whitewashing the state of Israel, I am picking this video in particular. Why dedicate an entire video on how Unpacked covers the Ottoman Empire? Well, it's because of what I said before about how every country needs a narrative, a story to justify its existence. Israel has created many myths about why they as a state should exist. You might be familiar with some of these, like how Palestine is the ancestral home of the Jewish people, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, Palestine doesn't exist, etc. and etc. But there is one myth which I believe is the most important for Israel, a myth that is at the very core of Zionism itself. Israel is the world's only safe haven for the Jewish people. This narrative is, in my opinion, the most effective out of all of them, because what it does is that it makes you think of the centuries of persecution, exile, and killings Jewish people have suffered from. It implies that Jewish people have never been accepted in any country, in any society, in any time in history, and that the only way they can truly be safe, the only way they can escape these centuries of persecution is by creating their own nation. That is why I believe Zionist groups like Unpacked exists. They use history to legitimize these talking points. The Ottoman Empire is key here because it's one of history's clearest examples of Jews finding refuge and building new lives under Muslim rule. The Ottomans are living proof of Islam's just treatment of not only Jewish people, but all of humanity. And while Unpacked does acknowledge some of the good things that the Ottoman Empire has done for the Jewish people, they also make so many lies about Islam and the Ottoman Empire that all you end up with is a distorted view on the topic. Unpacked especially does this by claiming that during the last decades of the Ottoman Empire, Jews faced anti-Semitism, poverty, and violence to the point where they had to leave the caliphate. These claims feed into the Zionist talking points that even in the most prosperous empire for Jews, they still ended up oppressed, leaving, according to them, Israel as the only answer for their safety. This is false in so many ways, but unfortunately it is very, very popular. People genuinely believe that without Israel, Jewish people will never have a safe place to go to. So even when, for example, people bring up the occupation of the Palestinians and that Israel is illegitimate, the Israelis say, well then, where else are we supposed to go? We've been oppressed everywhere, even though that is not true, because as I said, the Ottoman Empire was a literal safe haven for the Jewish people. But unfortunately, Unpacked twists this narrative. They even go out of their way to lie about a sultan who protected Jewish people of being anti-Semitic himself. You'll see exactly why I'm responding to this video once you hear what Unpacked has to say.
In the 7th century, Islamic armies began conquering lands across the Middle East, North Africa, and Southern Europe. As the caliphate spread, Muslim leaders faced questions on what to do with non-Muslims who would not submit to conversion living within their new borders. They eventually settled on the Pact of Umar, which declared Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians dhimmis, or people of the Pact. This status allowed Jews significant autonomy and protection, but demanded a special tax called the Jizya and established rules that made Jews and other dhimmis second-class citizens.
Those quote-unquote rules that Unpacked shows on screen are a reference to the so-called Pact of Umar, supposedly a treaty between Umar radiallahu anh and Christians living in Syria at the time. For the Muslims watching, you've probably never heard of the Pact of Umar before, and that's because it doesn't actually exist, or at least not the version Unpacked shows you in the video. You see, this so-called Pact of Umar has been doubted for many reasons, because according to Bernard Lewis, who extensively did research about Jews under Islamic rule, the document can hardly be considered authentic. It is not normal for the vanquished, i.e. the dhimmi, to propose treaties of the surrender to the victors, Umar radiallahu anh, nor it is likely that Syrian Christians in the 7th century who knew no Arabic and undertook not to study the Quran would echo its language and provisions so faithfully. Some of the clauses clearly reflected developments from a somewhat later period. And to add on to that, Sir Thomas Arnold, another historian on the topic, also brings up how the earliest mention of the Pact of Umar was over 400 years after the so-called treaty was signed. So in short, this so-called Pact of Umar used in the video can hardly be taken seriously. You might think Unpacked just made a harmless mistake, but it isn't. citing a fake treaty allegedly signed by one of the most beloved companions of the Prophet ﷺ is so damaging because it suggests that Muslims at the time treated Christians and Jews as inferior when that wasn't the case. Because if you read the real peace treaty between Umar radiallahu anh and the Christians at the time, it clearly shows that Umar promised the safety of themselves, their property, churches, crosses, and their rituals. Umar also promised them that if they paid their taxes, then it was an obligation for the Muslims to uphold this treaty. That last sentence also debunks Unpacked's claim about the Jizya, about how it supposedly made non-Muslims second-class citizens.
This status allowed Jews significant autonomy and protection, but demanded a special tax called the Jizya and established rules that made Jews and other dhimmis second-class citizens.
This is a clear misunderstanding because the Jizya tax served to establish a pact between the Muslim rulers and the non-Muslim communities. At the time, if the non-Muslims paid the tax, they were guaranteed the freedom to practice their faith, preserve their places of worship, and most importantly, exempt from military service. It's important to note that the Jizya only applied to non-Muslims who were of military age. Women, children, the old, the disabled, the blind, and monks were all exempt from paying. There were also occasions when non-Muslims were given back their jizya when the Muslims couldn't guarantee their safety. A good example of this was during the Muslim conquest of the Middle East. At the time, the Byzantines counterattacked and forced the Muslims to retreat from Syria. Knowing this, the Ottoman governors gave back the jizya the non-Muslims paid in Syria and said the following: "We give you back the money that we took from you, as we have received news that a strong force is advancing against us. The agreement between us was that we should protect you, and as this is not now in our power, we return you all that we took. But if we are victorious, we shall consider ourselves bound to you by the old terms of our agreement." But here is the fascinating bit. The Syrian Christians at the time responded by thanking the Muslims for their honesty, saying, "May God give you rule over us again and make you victorious over the Romans." Had it been they would not have given us back anything, but would have taken all that remains with us. This is the part that I really want to stress, because even how Unpacked continues the video, they imply that the Muslim world, while being better than Europe, was just a lesser of two evils.
In times of economic prosperity, these rules were often relaxed or ignored, but they ensured Jews remained second-class citizens throughout the Muslim world. Despite the challenges of the dhimmi status, such restrictions were preferable to the massacres and forced conversions that Jews faced in Europe.
This is so disingenuous because when Unpacked says that these rules were often relaxed or ignored, what rules? You mean the rules from the fabricated Pacts of Umar? When you put that fake treaty to the side, there isn't much to suggest that Jews were oppressed under Islam, unless you think that the jizya is a form of oppression. But again, the jizya was a payment that guaranteed non-Muslims didn't have to serve in the army and protection from the Islamic State. Like, why would Jews, why would Christians, why would Zoroastrians at the time care about jihad and fighting for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when they aren't even Muslim? Ironically, it would have been oppressive to force non-Muslims to fight for a cause they didn't even believe in. But again, there were times in history when non-Muslims fought for Muslim empires and they were exempt from paying the jizya. And there were also times when the jizya was refunded because protection of non-Muslims was not guaranteed, because again, the jizya was a contract, an agreement, not some tax to oppress Jewish people. What I'm trying to say here is that if you take away these 2 points Unpacked makes in their video, there's not much to suggest that Sharia law oppresses non-Muslims. Also, as I have already said, Unpacked tries to imply that the Muslim world was just a lesser of two evils when compared to Europe. That being a dhimmi, while oppressive, was still better than being killed in Europe. This line of argument annoys me personally because it downplays how the Muslim world allowed for all peoples, Muslims, Christians, and Jews to flourish. You cannot, and I'm going to say this very seriously, you cannot compare the treatment of Jewish people under Islam compared to how they were treated under the Christians in Europe, because the difference is night and day. It was the Muslims that fostered the Jewish Golden Age in Spain. It was the Christian world which led the Spanish Inquisition, eradicating over 1,000 years of Jewish presence in Spain and Portugal. It was the Muslims who allowed Jews to return to Jerusalem after 500 years of exile, while it was the Christians who, during the Crusades, butchered every single Jew in Jerusalem. And it was the Muslims who accepted Jewish refugees with open arms, and it was the Christians who exiled and ethnically cleansed Jews from their land. I am not saying this to overgeneralize. Yes, there were times in Islamic history that Jews were persecuted, and there were also many times that Jewish people in Europe flourished. But those are exceptions to the rule being that Sharia law treated non-Muslims with the dignity and respect they deserved, while in Europe, Jews were segregated from society, displaced from their homes, and murdered, all of which led to one of the worst genocides in the past 200 years. A lot of you probably found this to be tedious. Why did I spend so much time talking about the dhimmis and the Jizya and the Pact of Umar? You'll be so surprised how much these lies continue to be spread without much pushback. Whether it's websites or journalists or Zionists or ex-Muslims or even YouTube channels such as Unpacked. You have so many Muslims doing a great job in explaining Tawheed and the preservation of the Quran, which, don't get me wrong, it is good. That sort of da'wah is needed for the internet. But when it comes to these lies about history, like how Sharia law oppresses non-Muslims, or how the Jizya humiliates Christians and Jews, or how Muslims have massacred non-Muslims, these narratives continue to be flown right under the radar. And that is why I personally dedicate my videos to debunking these lies, to show how Islam is a rahmah, a mercy upon the people. So while Unpacked spends a good chunk of the video talking about how Jews sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire, by starting off their video with a fake version of the Pact of Umar and how Jews were second-class citizens under Islam, it taints everything else that the Ottomans did for the Jewish people. Because at the end of the day, people will watch this video and then think Jews were just second-class citizens of the Ottoman Empire anyway. Here's the thing. I don't expect Unpacked to properly know about the dhimmi system. That isn't why I'm spending all this time breaking down their claims. I'm just saying, don't put a question in one of your quote-unquote educational resources asking kids what dhimmis are and then telling them the correct answer is simply that they're just second-class citizens. Again, this goes back to why I make these videos in the first place, to debunk arguments such as these, which get spread to millions of people. At the end of the day, these claims about Islam reinforce the Zionist talking points about how Jews have never been truly accepted by any society, even by the Muslims who themselves were the most accepting to the Jewish people. There is a reason why I believe that Zionist groups and even the Israeli state itself endorses Unpacked's content, because a good chunk of Unpacked's videos tries to justify Israel's existence by fueling the narratives that Jewish people need to carve out their own state to protect themselves from anti-Semitic hate. Like, even when Unpacked talks about the Ottoman Empire in their video, the only part that actually includes some semblance of truth, they still don't do it justice because they oversimplify the history between the Ottoman Empire and the Jewish people.
Ashkenazi Jews found safety with the Ottomans after mass expulsions from Hungary and France in the 14th century, followed by a wave of Sephardic Jews from Spain and Portugal fleeing the Inquisition in the 15th century. Jewish European immigrants intermingled with the Romanian Jews of the former Byzantine Empire and Mizrahi Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, who were already living under Ottoman control. The Sultan scoffed at the Spanish for expelling the community, saying the king has impoverished his own country and enriched mine.
Yeah, technically this is true, but the way Unpacked frames it is that Jewish people only came because they were expelled from Europe. But what this does is downplay the fact that it was the Ottomans themselves who encouraged Jews to come to their land. Just to give an example, when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed II wrote to the Jewish communities in Anatolia, encouraged them to migrate to Istanbul, saying, "God has granted me many countries and ordered me to protect the progeny of his servants Abraham and Jacob, to give them food and to take them under my protection, who would like to come and settle in Istanbul, in the capital city, to live in peace under the shadow of their own vineyards and fig tree, to trade freely and to own properties." It was because of Mehmed's efforts to bring Jews to Istanbul that the city had, at one point in history, the largest Jewish community in the entire world, a community that still exists today. Unpacked also brought up how Jews from Spain migrated to the Ottoman Empire, without mentioning the fact that it was the Sultan himself, Bayezid II, who facilitated this migration. It was Sultan Bayezid who sent letters to his governors ordering them to accept Jewish refugees into his lands, and it was Sultan Bayezid who sent the Ottoman navy to rescue the Jews and Muslims in Spain. It's these details that Unpacked fails to mention. This is important because by ignoring them, they are downplaying the Ottoman Empire's role in protecting and growing the Jewish community. Even when Unpacked talks about Jewish life in the Ottoman Empire, they still leave out a lot of crucial information.
Jews also brought skills with medicine and finance, becoming bankers, doctors, and political advisors. One Italian Jew even became the personal physician of the Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror.
Again, this is all true, but what Unpacked doesn't tell you is that the Italian Jew who worked under Mehmed II was more than his personal physician. He was also Mehmed's financial advisor and translator, accompanying the Sultan on all of his military campaigns. Mehmed was so hospitable and so kind to his physician that not only did he convert to Islam, he changed his name to Yaqub and became an Ottoman vizier in the final years of his life. It's this beautiful story that shows how Jews flourished under the Ottoman Empire, with some even climbing the ranks to serve the sultans themselves. And by the way, it wasn't just one Jewish doctor. Entire generations of Jewish physicians served in the Ottoman imperial court. In the Ottoman Empire, Jews were able to start a new life, and they flourished for several hundred years. But Unpacked did not cover this properly. Instead, they skimmed over these fine details to focus more on the decline of the Ottoman Empire and its negative impacts on the Jewish community, something that is largely embellished.
But the relatively good times couldn't last. Starting in 1699, Austrian and Russian conquest chipped away at Ottoman control, while the colonial empires of Western Europe opened new shipping lanes with America and East Asia that threatened the primacy of the Silk Road. These changes plunged many Jewish communities into poverty, erasing much of the wealth they had built in more prosperous years. Meanwhile, as Ottoman Jews found their home and livelihood under siege, Jews in Europe thrived. Wealth and medical advancements enabled the Jewish population of Europe to nearly triple from 1800 to 1880, while the Ottoman Jewish population stagnated.
That's not true. Yes, the Jewish community in the Ottoman Empire did decline over the next few centuries, but you can't take population growth as a metric for Jewish life. This is because while the Jewish population in Europe grew massively, they still continued to face anti-Semitism. Keep in mind, this population growth was at the same time as the blood libels in Europe and the pogroms in Russia. That's the very reason why Zionism exists, because many Jews in Europe were convinced that integrating into European society was not possible. They thought that with the French Revolution, they were finally free and that they could finally assimilate into society, but they couldn't. Because at the end of the day, as I said earlier in the video, Europe has never accepted Jewish people into the societies, whereas under the Muslim world, the Jewish people were. And this is why, despite the problems the Ottoman Empire faced, which I will talk about later, Jews in Europe continued to migrate to the Caliphate. Quote, "The Ottoman Empire continued to receive new waves of Jewish refugees from various parts of Europe who were fleeing the political and religious reaction that followed the Napoleonic era in the early 19th century, the conservative reaction to the revolutions of 1848, persecution and pogroms in Central Europe and Russia, starting in the 1880s and 1890s, the Bolshevik Revolution and Russian Civil War during and after World War I, and finally, during the time of the Turkish Republic after 1923, Jews who fled from the greatest persecution of them all, the Holocaust in the 1930s and during World War II. Look, I'm not saying that conditions for the Jewish people were the exact same as it was during the Ottoman Empire's peak. The Jewish community did decline over the next few centuries, but despite that, the Jewish community remained very influential in the Ottoman Empire. They continued to join the Ottoman government in numbers far exceeding their share of the population, and they played a very important role in the empire's trade and commerce. And most importantly, Jews continued to migrate to the Ottoman Empire for safety, and suggest that Jews living in Europe were better off than those living under the Ottoman Empire is just untrue.
Jews throughout the empire continued to suffer poverty and violence. The anger displayed towards Jews in Damascus spilled into other cities, including Istanbul, Jerusalem, and Rhodes. One Jew in Beirut said, "We can hardly leave our homes. Everybody, great and small alike, attacks us and forces their way into our houses." The Ottomans also struggled to maintain control of their empire, which led to a power vacuum that encouraged violence.
See, the thing that Unpacked doesn't address is that the Jewish community did not experience the exact same conditions everywhere in the Ottoman Empire. Yes, when the Ottomans were on the decline, anti-Semitic attacks did increase, like what Unpacked brought up in the video. But you have to keep in mind that the Ottoman Empire spanned 3 continents, from Bosnia all the way to Yemen. And because the Ottomans were a pre-industrial empire, your distance from the capital was a huge factor in what you actually experienced. Whether that was persecution, corruption, or protection, this applied to every single person in the Ottoman Empire, regardless of religion, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish alike. For instance, Jews in the European provinces of the Ottoman Empire continued to prosper as usual, to the point where Edirne's Jewish population actually doubled during the late 1800s, becoming one of the most important Jewish communities in the Caliphate. Meanwhile, other Jewish communities in the more remote regions of the empire, like let's say in Lebanon, probably did face more violence, just as Unpacked said. But honestly, that's always been the case for the Ottoman Empire. Even during the golden age of the Ottoman Empire, the more remote provinces were, at times, corrupt and oppressive. That is why Jews in those remote regions relied on the Sharia courts to guarantee themselves justice and protection from the Sultan. This was the case during the Ottoman Empire's golden age, and it continued to be the case even when the Ottomans were experiencing wars and poverty. So getting back to the point here, the reason why Unpacked is wrong is because they suggest that the entire Jewish community was facing oppression, when that wasn't the case. The majority of Jews lived in the relatively stable regions of the empire, such as Istanbul or Salonika, where they were protected by the Sultan. Then there were the smaller Jewish communities that lived in distant places such as Beirut, which definitely would have struggled with violence and less protection simply because of its distance from the Ottoman capital. But this is where we get to the worst part of the video. I'll be quite honest with you. Unpack's claims about the Pact of Umar or claims about anti-Semitism do not warrant a 40-minute response to them. But what does warrant a response is how Unpacked lies about Sultan Abdul Hamid II. I've already discussed him in great length before, but know that he was a staunch defender of the Ummah, to the point where he turned down $2 billion to make sure that Palestine was not colonized by the Zionists at the time. So how Unpacked proceeds to twist this is so disgusting.
The situation deteriorated so much that in 1891, in reaction to a new wave of Jewish immigrants fleeing to what was known as the region of Palestine, the land of Israel, the Ottomans took an unprecedented step, banning Jewish migration to Ottoman lands. This ban failed to stem the tide of migration, but the message was clear. The land that saved so many Jews had closed its doors.
Honestly, where do I start? I can make an excuse for every single claim that Unpacked has made so far, but this is just character assassination to the highest degree. Abdul Hamid never banned Jews from coming to the Ottoman Empire. I don't even know how anyone would even seriously claim that. Jewish people continue to flee the Ottoman Empire in droves because of the anti-Semitism that was rife in Europe. Abdul Hamid was the same man who allowed thousands of Romanian Jews fleeing massacres to settle into Anatolia. What Abdul Hamid did have a problem with was with Jewish people settling in one particular place, Palestine, because he was well aware that the Zionists wanted to settle in Palestine to carve out a Jewish state. Like, you really need to ask yourself, why would Jews fleeing to the Ottoman Empire come to Palestine out of all places? Why couldn't they go to the already established Jewish communities like Istanbul or Salonika or Edirne, some of the wealthiest places in the Ottoman Empire that had the guaranteed protection of the Sultan? Well, it's because, again, Abdul Hamid was well aware that the Zionist movement was deliberately moving Jewish people to Palestine to eventually create their own state. Unpacked even admits this in one of their own videos.
Anti-Semitism surged. The 1881 to 1884 Russian pogroms terrified Jews worldwide with over 200 anti-Jewish riots, unleashing mass rowdiness and rape. The pogroms destroyed many Jews' hope that they would be accepted by everyone. Many desperately wanted to escape, but where could they go? A few Jewish nationalists championed Zionism to fight hatred and rebuild the Jewish community by returning Jews to their homeland. Enter Zionism version 3. Born again and maturing into adulthood, Zionism now focused on establishing a Jewish state in the way that so many other modern states formed. This is also when the actual term Zionism was introduced, first coined in 1890 by the Viennese anti-religious rebel Nathan Birnbaum. And it was at the First World Zionist Congress in 1897 that a charismatic journalist named Theodor Herzl launched the formal Zionist movement to win Jewish statehood in Israel, renamed Palestine by the Romans.